Well, thank you. I can see that this is not one of those religious orders in which everyone eats in silence while one person reads the text. But then again, I'm not going to read the Bible. So I'm not even going to adhere precisely to the title, though to the abstract, yes, there was an attempt to adjust. And I plan to speak longer. I'm a professor. I thought I can always talk for an hour. I won't. I will end precisely on time, but that may mean I'm halfway finished. So we see. The process called secularization has been subject to much critical reappraisal in recent years. Many have questioned whether secularization was in fact a general trend of modernity or something more specific, perhaps a European exception to global trends. Some have noted that secularization was not so complete or irreversible, even in Europe, as was once widely argued. The term post-secular grants that there was some time, or at least some intellectual consensus, when secularity could be presumed, but then suggests that this presumption no longer holds. So secular a thinker as Jürgen Habermas has argued that we must not only accept that religion is part of public life, but ask whether it has potentially valuable, even crucial contributions to make. Now, the basic structure of my talk is to explore a bit what secularization means, relate that to the theme of the conference, individual and community, suggest that we are seeing a continued destabilization of the meaning of individual and community, not just the balance, but the meaning, that for all of our discussions of religion in the public sphere, there is still a great deal of anxiety about this ostensibly post-secular moment, and as a result, we are losing some of the intellectual resources with which we might think the transformation of the human itself. Now, in much of the discourse about secularism and secularization, secularization is treated and disputed in terms of what Charles Taylor has called a subtraction story. This is the notion that secularization, whatever else we make of it, involved a simple decline of religion that left the rest of society more or less as it had been. This has been particularly true over the debates over the secularism of public spaces. If religion plays no role, or its role is managed effectively and fairly, then a public space, or a public sphere, or a public policy is dubbed secular. And for many, that's the end of the story. But in fact, secularization is not simply a decline in the authority of older religious beliefs, faiths, or communities. Such a view of the mere subtraction of religion underestimates the reach and magnitude and interconnectedness of the transformations involved. To rely less on religion changed everything else as well. Now, extending this argument, it would also be a mistake to view secularization simply as an addition of new ideas or authorities, of science, of secular political leaders, or of markets. These are all parts of the modern transformation, but only parts. The key word is transformation. This goes for public spaces and spheres and policies as well. First, the development of publics, spaces and spheres and policies, but for the moment, let me not repeat that every time and just say publics, was an important feature of European Western modernity and many alternative modernities around the world, though I'm not going to discuss the variations much here. Religion, and indeed religious conflict, played a central role in this. It is an oddity of Habermas's famous book on the structural transformation of the public sphere that it never discusses religion. And its account starts with the development of literary, market, and political publics in the 18th century. There would be a strong case for starting in the 17th or even the 16th century, tracing the story of vernacular literacy to translation and printing of the Bible, seeing the circulation of sermons and tracts, the development of Sunday schools, all as basic to the rise of a larger scale public sphere. Starting in the 17th century could also remind us of the rise of science itself as a public phenomenon, shaped by invisible colleges of correspondence, new institutions like Britain's Royal Society, and the insistence that all scientific findings be made public. Science, in many ways, was a model public sphere, but again, before the account that Habermas gives, the time period that he deals with. The need to make findings public in science has to do with the importance of dispute and testing and correction of errors to the very notion of a scientific method. That is, it's not just the individual laboratory, it's the larger institution of science. And arguably, Habermas over time shifted his view, and many people have taken a view that this is more or less what the political public sphere should do. But there are other dimensions still, even a spatial architectural one, in which a core feature was the development of Europe's towns around public squares, like Bologna's Piazza Maggiore. Crucially, there was the rise of the state. If it is important that religion was part of the story of the formation of the modern public, even the modern secular public, it is also important that religion was not the whole story. Second, as I already suggested, the disciplining of publicness to exclude or manage religion was never simply a subtraction of religion, it was a transformation. We need to ask what else was disciplined or pushed to the margins along with religion. And let me simply put down a marker here for a theme to which I hope to return, time permitting. It was not only divine inspiration that was made suspect in the particular formation of modern publics as, ideally, spheres of rational critical debate on subjects of material policy concern for modern states. It was also human imagination. I've suggested that we need to understand the shifting place of religion, not just as subtraction or addition, but as a bigger set of transformations. Now, what are these and why do they matter in this context for this lecture? It's not just a general observation about how everything is connected, true as that may be, but a necessary theme in thinking about individual and community. Let me take a single but powerful example: scale. At the same time that religious practices, communities, and authorities were transformed to produce a secular age, the scale of societal organization grew enormously. Certainly, there were far-flung empires and long-distance trade before the modern era, but our era has been distinctively constituted by building infrastructures and systems that enable social organization on an unprecedented and very large scale. We produce the food to feed 8 billion human beings, even if we don't always get it to those who need it. Most of those people live in cities. At least 20 of those cities have more than 15 million inhabitants, though there are debates on exactly how to count. They are nodes in transportation and communications systems that connect all the continents of the world and connect the actions of each person to others in a constant work of coordination and sometimes conflict. These systems are, in some degree, self-moving, automatic or autopoietic, as the movement of prices in relation to supply and demand can proceed without the intervention of king or politicians in Adam Smith's famous image of the invisible hand. This is a difference in kind that is closely related to the difference in scale. It is not just that there are more people in more widely dispersed social relations. The development of socio-technical systems that are at least partially autopoietic transforms human relatedness. We have relationships with other people we confront face to face. We enjoy the conviviality at every table in this conference lunch. We even have face-to-face relationships with strangers in relatively casual contexts, shop clerks, for example. But all of this is different from the growing proportion, indeed majority, of our relationships with other people, which are now indirect, mediated by complex organizational systems or technologies, making it impossible in principle to find out who is on the other end of the relationship. Who made your shoes? Now, if you have very expensive, individually handcrafted shoes, it may be possible to find the craftsman. But in general, in a modern market society, this important human relationship is an invisible, untraceable relationship. You know the shoes got made, you know there was a market, you know there are prices, but there is interposed a kind of essential indirectness in the human relationship. It is not enough to say that modern life is shaped deeply by sociability with strangers then. It's also the case that modern life is made possible by and deeply shaped by relationships organized through socio-technical systems in which people play roles but are not directly sociable with each other, not addressed as persons, not even anonymous persons, as, for example, a politician's speech may address the people, and in principle could be addressed to each individual person, though it's addressed to the anonymous whole. But that's not the case with the global market, right? There's also power on a new scale. States are bigger, and they play different roles. State power is not just coercive power, the kind of power exercised by monarchs who could say, "Off with her head," like the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland, or governments that put people in prison or detention camps, though indeed states do this in unprecedented numbers today. Militaries and police are important, but modern states also wield infrastructural power, in the phrase of Michael Mann. They build highways and telecommunications systems. They run schools and hospitals. They provide unemployment insurance and old age pensions. They subsidize efforts at industrial innovation and trade policy. Of course, they collect taxes in ways that are not only large scale, but never neutral. States exercise their power both in relationship to actual persons and in relationship to socio-technical systems. So do corporations. I have in mind mainly business corporations, but in fact philanthropies and many nonprofit organizations also operate as corporations, and states are really a special kind of corporation. Corporations also wield power. Some business corporations are in fact larger and more powerful than most states. Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and for that matter, Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent are among the current giants. Each of those 7 is larger in financial terms than any but the dozen largest countries in the world. Okay? These are not democratic. In general, they are not objects of public address in the same way states are, though this is not impossible. You could hold a protest rally outside the headquarters of one of these companies. When we speak of a public corporation, we mean only one whose shares are traded publicly rather than held exclusively within a private group like a family corporation, not public in other senses. Now, all these changes reconstitute the world, and in this reconstitution, growth in the number of human beings and in the scale of their settlements and systems of power have been what are called secular trends. They march forward in time, the same root meaning of secular as the opposition to religious discourse. They are not eternal givens. They have been growing, indeed, arguably accelerating throughout the modern era. They have shaped our secular experience, that is our experience of the material temporal world, for both religious and non-religious people. It's not as though religious people do not inhabit the secular world. If religious, we may still contrast this to a more eternal or timeless reality. But it is of enormous power for shaping even what we understand religion to be. Human beings live longer lives. We live amid constant transformations of technology, of culture, of relationships. We live amid constant mediated awareness of at least some of what is happening at a great distance in the world, but at the same time. So we relate, for example, to humanitarian emergencies across the world in a form of simultaneity, expecting somehow, seeking somehow to be able to make a moral response despite the distance, an expanded sense of moral obligation. But at the same time, as we live with this quickening of change, this apparent acceleration, we live with a sense of disconnection from it all. Already 150 years ago, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote of capitalism that constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away, and all new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. One doesn't have to be a Marxist to see the truth in this characterization. It still makes sense in our era of smartphones, artificial intelligence, and gene editing, of globalization, instantaneous market updates, and cyber attacks. But we may doubt the conclusion Marx and Engels drew from this, that as a result, humanity would, quote, at last be compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Now, aside from the sexist language, note in this, right, the idea that there would be a stripping away of all illusions and simply a confrontation with reality, sensory reality. It is far from clear that accelerating growth in scale and constant disruptive change have freed humanity from illusions or compelled us to realism. We seem, for example, to have a very hard time facing, with sober senses, the possible eradication of our real conditions of life by climate change and environmental degradation. In this, we seem to be facing yet another accelerating process of change and growing scale, and yet we seem to experience it as continuing without end. We may talk about urgency, but for the most part, we treat life as going on with all of this no more disturbing than our smartphones becoming outdated by the next model. Third step. You'll be glad to know there are only 5. I don't intend this lecture to be a catalog of material changes and challenges faced by humanity. Rather, I've tried simply to evoke these at the outset and to indicate how integrally connected are the secular trends of worldly transformation and the process we call secularization. In short, we built a world in which these new processes do a huge amount of shaping of the world. And that is the world we call secular in some part. The transformation of the place of religion in the world did not take place independently of all these other transformations. This broader sense of transformation is necessary, I want to suggest, to fully make sense of the challenges posed today by new appearances of religion in secular public space, and by the terms chosen for the theme of this conference: individual and community. Let me turn to community first. It is misleading to use the term community for all the forms of social existence and commitment in our lives, for all that stands as the social counterpoint to individual. The basic feature of the modern world is that there isn't just a choice between individual and community, right? There is a contrast between individual, community, and an extraordinary range of very large scale and very powerful structures of social organization, right, which are not well captured by the contrast individual and community. Nonetheless, we tend sometimes to counterpose individual to community as though community stands for everything social, and these are the self-evident two forms of human existence. Community, I think, has a more precise meaning in webs of relationships that knit human beings to each other in mutual commitments. Community commonly incorporates families, but this need not be part of the definition. We can, for example, meaningfully speak of monastic communities or other communities of faith in which individuals are more autonomously members, not through their families. We think of community often in its place-based form, the village or the small town, paradigmatically, but also the urban neighborhood, or communities forged within cities by those who share ethnicity or faith or indeed lifestyle choices and choose to make this the basis for their interdependence. Place-based communities are particularly important, though, because they anchor a human relationship to nature and potentially a relationship of care for the endangered natural world, and they are at odds or in tension with the despatialized structure of much of what goes on in indirect human relations. Contrasting local community to larger scale society was a staple of 19th century social thought, invoking binary oppositions like Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. These focused attention on transformations not only in scale, but in kind of social relations. Cities, they suggested, were sites of more voluntary association, less sense of community of fate. People were knit together by contracts, not statuses. The anonymity of cities allowed new kinds of freedom as people could express different sides of themselves in different contexts. In a small village, it's difficult to be or portray yourself as a different person at work, at church, in a social engagement on Friday night. And this has all sorts of implications for freedom. Though, I might add, a freedom enjoyed very differentially by the relatively well-off, so that the opposition of the city and the countryside takes on a hint of elite versus others in many discourses. At the same time, the notion of community was also claimed for translocal solidarities, especially for nations. Here, the rhetoric of community necessarily meant something different from the local context. It could not be just a matter of densely interconnected relationships. Even in a small country of 2 or 3 or 4 million people, they cannot all be your face-to-face contacts, your neighbors, your friends. It's a different kind already of relationship. There is something projected about the nation by claiming it as a community or a family, as some nationalist rhetorics do. Really, we're just a community, but in fact we're more, right? The nations involved categories of people joined by common culture or by the idea of a common culture, even if it was an elite minority culture and not the culture of everyone, or by representation in some fashion, and media played a big role. Nation was in some ways a competitor to local community, and political publics came to be organized overwhelmingly in national terms. To anticipate, it is in these national publics that questions of religion and secularism are most acute, not at the local level. And the secular public sphere is constructed not neutrally, but as the national public sphere, right, in an ideological construct of its own. In other words, it's not empty, but for the potential pollution of religious voices intruding, it's filled with contents of various kinds. Now, fourth, what it is to be a human individual has itself changed, partly because of changes in societal organization, partly, as we'll see, for technology. We can see something of the shift in the way nations are imagined and rhetorically constituted. Modern nations sometimes use a vocabulary of family, as I just suggested. They talk about lineage. They imagine all Frenchmen are descended from Asterix the Gaul, or something like this, right? But in general, right, they much more basically connect individuals to the whole. It's as though nationhood, nationality, was almost inscribed into the body, or at least the basic personal identity of each person, and obviously the legal status of being a citizen shapes basically what rights one can actually exercise. In this sense, individuals are understood not through webs of personal relationships or of roles like parents and child, sister and brother, but as equivalents in a series, following Walter Benjamin's idea of the serial as a constituted factor in modernity. Nations are a preeminent example of this serial notion of individuals in a larger categorical identity. That's a mouthful. What do I mean? I mean that when we say you or you are the members of a nation, we say insofar as you are national, you are equivalently national. You are in a series of all those people who are French or Russian or Israeli or Palestinian or whatever else, right? That the structure of nationhood, like the structure of citizenship, and it turns out the structure of human rights thinking, depends on a serial notion of individuals that for that purpose are equivalent. Now, by saying two people are members of the same nation and equivalent nationally, we aren't necessarily saying they're equally wealthy or equally intelligent or equally beautiful, and we know that. But we are, in a very important sense, making this egalitarian serial ascription. And all sorts of things don't work if we begin to undermine that. If we don't have this notion of equally a part of the nation, equally a citizen, one person, one vote, all sorts of things begin to be suspect in this. This fits with the punctual self of Western modernity, again to use a Charles Taylor term. That is, each person is token of a type, one unit of a whole, but it's in tension with the idea that each of us is possessed of a unique individuality. We have just become exemplars of this serial relationship of equivalence rather than unique individuals. And in different ways, a variety of Western thinkers have distinguished treating other people merely as objects from treating them as subjects of value. Immanuel Kant's argument against taking any other person to be merely a means to our ends is a familiar example of this. Martin Buber wrestled with the same issue in distinguishing the I-it relationship from the I-thou. The I-thou relation involves, he said, recognition of the other as a person, as having a spiritual dimension, and thus the relationship between the two people as a potential path into relationship with God. Levinas develops similar things in his notion of alterity. But let us note the difficulty posed here by the extent to which our relations to other people in the modern world are not to individual persons, but to some combination of individuals as the serial units of categories, say members of nations, and individuals obscured in the indirect relationships of complex socio-technical systems, some of which seem to move of themselves. This does not make stronger recognition of humanness or spiritual communion impossible. We can, for example, approach human rights with ideas of reverence for all human beings, each equally exemplifying the category. But it's a challenge. It makes it harder to see the spirituality, sacredly human, in, say, market actors. Right? Not impossible, harder to be able to see the more deeply human in those who are connected to us only by these systems of indirect relations. It's worth noting, if only in passing, another example of the troubled character of the individual person in the modern world. This is the idea that the corporation is itself an individual. The idea is encouraged in much corporate law, though there are differences in national legal traditions. Corporations may be understood in other ways as creatures of contract, but let me go to the heart of this. The whole idea of limited liability, that you can sue a corporation and every individual investor doesn't have to pay you, though they might lose some value of their shares, right? This kind of security is basic to the modern world. Modern relationships of finance, corporate bonds, lending depend on it, a separation between the corporation and the holders. Now, corporations, when they're distinguished from their investors, managers, and other members, take on a new attribute. This is integral, as I said, to notions of limited liability, and makes possible large-scale markets. And one root notion of this, the idea of the business corporation, is in fact religious. It's the idea of the bishop as corporation soul in the Catholic Church and carried over into the Anglican and some other communions. The bishop as owner of church property is a legal and ecclesiastical construct separate from human personhood of the individual incumbent. And the concept is analogous to that of the king's two bodies, the late medieval distinction of the king as person and the king as office that enables us to say, the king is dead, long live the king, and ensure the smooth succession of rule as well as property. But this way of thinking about corporations as kind of persons also creates a fundamental asymmetry between human individuals and these artificial individuals, one on which our moral reasoning has been relatively quiet. Just let me evoke it in a sense. Like ordinary human beings, at least those of legal age and competency, corporations can own and sell property, enter into contracts, sue or be sued in courts of law. And this is a fundamental fact of modern society, this asymmetry between individuals and corporations at the same time as their equivalent legal status. You might observe that if you get into a lawsuit with, say, Google, you are not equal actors. Google has a much better chance of waiting you out until you go away or die than you have of waiting Google out. And this is true on a smaller scale in landlord-tenant law and a whole variety of other things. But we've also introduced this new idea of person, which is rewriting something of the core underlying idea of the human person. The human person becomes the person able to enter into contracts, to own property, to sue and be sued. In extraordinary, but perhaps predictable extensions, corporations can be treated as citizens possessed of civil rights in various countries, including my own. In the decision called Citizens United, the U.S. Supreme Court famously affirmed that corporations are entitled to the constitutional protection of their freedom of speech because they are people and because they are citizens, and thus that there should not be limits on their financial contributions to political campaigns. Now, apropos of religion and secularity in matters of public policy, this then becomes one of the arguments deployed to assert that there should be no restrictions on the political activities of religious bodies, since they are generally speaking incorporated legally in most modern societies, and fare, up better or worse, with business corporations, though with the special unaddressed status of tax exemptions. Now, here we come to my last theme in my attempt to wrap this all together, because you are no doubt saying, now wait, I thought we started with secularity and we got onto the individual and community. Right. What joins human beings in the larger category humanity, and what makes humanity of special value? We talk about things like, will the robots displace the humans, and imply that it matters, that we care. Well, why do we care? There are a variety of answers in different historical traditions. Religion is central to many of them, but the process of secularization and wider societal transformation to which it is linked has encouraged the forgetting or hollowing out of some of these, and there are now new challenges. For example, the book of Genesis tells us that human beings are created in the image of God. This gives rise to long interpretative traditions, which I can't begin to summarize. And I don't just mean I don't have time, I really mean I can't. They take up many ways in which being created in the image of God distinguishes human beings, including, not least, free will, knowledge of good and evil, reason, and the capacity ourselves to consciously create. Let me dwell for a moment just on the last. That is, that human beings can continue the process of world-making, begun but not ended by God's creation. This is not in every interpretation, but many, Talmudic and others of this. Human beings will continue to make the world, and indeed human beings have continued to make the world. And most of this world that I described of socio-technical systems, of large-scale markets, of states, right, is a human-made world, right? But a human-made world that often appears alien to human beings, even though it is described sometimes as consisting of persons, like corporate persons. Then again, also with roots in Genesis, there is the notion of a great chain of being, or of a natural hierarchy intrinsic to creation, in which human beings are placed below God and the angels, but given dominion over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature which moves on the ground. Versions of the great chain of being elaborated the distinct places of different sorts of human beings, lords and serfs, for example, in a relational but very hierarchical understanding. They distinguished the human from other living creatures, both on earth and in heaven. We are not mere animals, but neither are we gods or angels. We are also living, of course, and thus distinct from the no longer living, though they too have a special status in the order of the universe, varying among religious traditions from veneration of the ancestors to souls awaiting elevation from purgatory into heaven. Ah, yes, souls. A core religious understanding of what each human was, or at least had, was a soul. I don't propose any exposition of the meaning of eternal soul in relationship to this mortal coil, which we might slough off at death, or still less to tackle questions about the individual identity of souls, in distinction to a more pantheistic understanding of being at one with God. My point is simply that there was a rhetoric for thinking about the human that was once both readily available and influential. In other words, pushed by some questions about what does it mean to be a person, what does it mean to be human, there was an answer more or less familiar in a widely understood, if not always deeply understood, vocabulary. This was the rhetoric, for example, in which the 16th century disputations of Valladolid tackled the question of whether, or in what sense, the native inhabitants of Spain's New World colonies were human. Right? Did they have eternal souls, in which case they required care and protection, albeit in a paternalistic understanding, and efforts at their conversion and salvation? Or did they not, in which case they were merely destined and suited for labor? Okay? Now, it's a question you might ask in other contexts, besides the inhabitants of the New World, and you might ask, in a sense, what answer is implied by the way that we treat various categories of people in these structures of interdependence and socio-technical systems in the large world. Or again, during that same 17th century, another kind of contrast became increasingly common in efforts to understand what it was to be human, the contrast of human to machine. This was shaped by the search for perpetual motion, the development of mechanical clocks, and a craze for developing mechanical birds and all manner of automata. For some, human beings were just a special kind of self-moving machine. For others, the distinction of human self-movement by free will was fundamental. But note something familiar in the issue which appears today in debates about artificial intelligence, though these are commonly impoverished by the thinness of understanding the human. That is, having all but forgotten the notion of soul, having lost faith in both the great chain of being and the idea of creation in the image of God, moderns are easily drawn into thinking that we are just algorithms, complex structures of code given organic genetic form on a carbon base rather than rendered on chips in silicon, but more or less interchangeable. This is the basis of the Transhumanist Movement, with its various ideas that we should somehow be able to upload the contents of our brains into machines and find eternal life. Not with God, right, but by virtue of a more or less mechanical operation. Complex one. You have to freeze the brain, slice it into very thin slices, somehow turn those into the equivalent of computer code. It's not clear to me how this works, right, but it is testimony to human desire. More than a few people are investing large sums of money in being frozen to await this rapture. In my view, this sort of thinking goes deeply astray in trying to understand what it is to be human, as well as in imagining migration into machines. For many, this is a view of human beings becoming gods, creators of life, as Yuval Harari argued in his bestseller, Homo Deus. Arguably, this is an extension of the biblical notion of being created in the image of God, but it is a quite radical one which presumes the absence of that original God of creation as described in Genesis. But let me leave the possible theological failings of this view aside and note two other ways I think it goes wrong that bear on the notions of individual and community, and then wrap up. First is the idea that as persons, we can be reduced to intelligence, or the processes of our brains. It's a radical reduction in the idea of human, though becoming almost automatically part of modern discourse, to think of us as intelligence, to think that computers will reach, quote, human-level intelligence, and to imagine that that is something that goes on in our brains. Now, modern neuroscience stresses that our brains are not autonomous and self-contained, that they are part of complex neural systems in which all the parts matter, that our cognition and emotion are influenced also by chemical processes, and that the cognitive neural system works only in relation to our bodies, managing relations to internal and external imbalances, seeking homeostasis. But leaving even the neuroscience part aside, right, and all the reasons this is a dubious scientific notion that we are just our brains, think of what a fundamental transformation of the human is, and then think of this second point. The notion that human intelligence is contained within individual brains or even individual bodies is misleading. Human intelligence is the product of sharing and learning, of language and culture, of communication and social relationships. The point is not just that our thinking stands on the shoulders of giants and others who have gone before, it is that we think in language and in dialogue, not in isolation. Now, hint, I want to say this has a bearing on thinking Dialogue 4.0 and on thinking the challenge of the supposedly secular and the self-identified religious in modern public spheres. Artificial intelligence may and probably will grow dramatically more powerful. I'm not suggesting the machines don't work. It will transform material production and change or eliminate many jobs. It will change the way all the socio-technical systems that connect us work, from transport to water supply to record keeping. It is already changing the work of doctors, lawyers, architects, and policemen. So I don't mean to suggest it is not powerful. By the way, I meant to add in an aside there. I'm going to add it in even though I'm running out of time, which of course the Church of England has now published a Common Prayer app. And the Common Prayer app is being upgraded to be aided by artificial intelligence to help the priest identify the needed passages for both particular services and particular challenges. Change everybody's job. What I want to suggest is that the processes of automation are largely social processes. We began the process of automation not simply with mechanical birds or the first computers, but with the modern state and the modern factory and the modern business enterprise. All socio-technical systems that work by establishing workflows, complex sets of instructions to govern the work of everybody within the whole. As Thomas Hobbes wrote on the first page of Leviathan, what is the state but an artificial person? If you don't remember the opening of Leviathan, it's instructive. Nature, The art whereby God hath made and governed the world is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. And he goes on to describe that artificial animal, which is the state, right? For what is life but a motion of limbs, right? What is the heart but a spring, and so forth. Now, this mechanical image of the person is renewed in many of the contemporary debates in machine intelligence and so forth, but it also has had a pervasive impact on simply how we think. So let me try to now keep going. One more example and ending. Think of genetic engineering, and in particular the techniques of gene editing that have made rapid strides in recent years. Using CRISPR-Cas9, for example, scientists already have the capacity to change the genetic makeup of unborn babies. This is illegal in most countries, though regulation may or may not be effective. It has already been done in China, though it's illegal in China too. For the most part, gene editing is being used to change plants and other non-human organisms, for example, to reduce susceptibility to various pests or diseases. But vulnerability is an essential part of the human condition. And we know that some of this vulnerability is shaped by genetics. Parents who are carriers of genes for potential diseases may be eager to have children born free from the risks posed by their genomes. Of course, gene editing has its own risks, but my point here again is that it challenges our received notion of the human and of what is and isn't beyond our control. The capacity to alter the genetic code shaping the lives of human individuals raises questions about what it means to think of those individuals as creatures of God or of nature. It raises questions about the idea that human beings are basically equal or deserving of equal rights, since we can make them manifestly unequal, and that is, of course, the point of engineering them. It raises questions about who should have the authority to change the genes of another person. Parents? If so, on what basis? Do they own their offspring, that they should be able to replace God or nature in determining their genetic makeup? In most regards, we think not, and generally think that the idea of people owning each other is repugnant. Should access to the technology be governed by the state, by the market, as is happening in the West? Can any one state successfully regulate it in a world where it can be made available to the rich through medical tourism? Now, let me just try to wind up because I'm told I should get done so you can ask questions. So I'm going to call done an impartial completion. All of this destabilizing of the human, I wanted to suggest, is something that's gone on recurrently through the modern era. We've changed our way of thinking about what human beings are. But through those series of changes, we have progressively built a secular world with relatively little engagement by and religious thinkers and reference to previous religious ideas of what constituted a person or indeed a community. As a result of this, when we begin to think about the individual and the community, and when we begin to think about the place of religion in contemporary society, we need to think about this larger sense of the secular world, not simply older ideas of things that may be said to be legitimate or not in public spheres, but how we engage this. We are, I think, losing some of the richness of religious heritages in providing terms that could be deployed to think about what's going on, a point not too different from Habermas's. But not only do we lose something of this linguistic richness, we lose something in our very understanding. And I think we fail to take on the challenge. The ways in which we seek to solve some older problems about religion in the secular public sphere, by marginalizing religious voices because they are not part of an entirely rational, critical search for truth, end up also marginalizing new religious voices and new non-religious voices that seek transcendence, that seek to transcend the idea that who we are and what we can be is essentially given to us by what is already here in the world, in the immanent frame. And thereby we are led to neglect the realm of possibility, which might give us better moral grounds for moving forward in this newly complex world. Thank you.